Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. I'm being joined by Sam Nelson. Now, he's an associate professor in the University of Toledo's Department of Political Science. We're going to be discussing the big issues that are going to be on voters' minds this election season, as well as the umbrella topic that really won't be, unless you're a voter of a certain age or political affiliation. What does a conflict overseas really have to do with a political election here in the States? Does it have any impact?
It can have an impact. We don't have a lot of foreign policy elections. That is, foreign policy is usually not at the top of the list for Americans when they vote, unless the United States is actively at war itself. So, for instance, George Bush's reelection in 2004, foreign policy was really important, especially after 9/11. But, 2008, 2012, those weren't foreign policy elections. Neither was 2016 or 2020. The current situation with Israel and Palestine, it may have an effect on the election in some places, particularly maybe an important state like Michigan.
And one of the things we have seen recently is the fact that younger voters, which Democrats usually perform pretty well with, they're starting to break with the party a bit on this issue. And so, will that have a substantial impact on President Joe Biden's reelection chances?
Certainly, it's a possibility. Joe Biden is going to need good turnout from young voters, and he's going to need them to turn out for him. I think that he will have a lot of time between now and the election to kind of consolidate some support with younger voters. Younger voters aren't really keen on Donald Trump either. So it's not as though he's losing them to Trump. He's maybe losing their enthusiasm for him right now. But they do view the Israel-Palestine conflict in Gaza, they view that differently than older Democrats do. And so I think that's a place where Democratic Party leaders like Joe Biden and in Congress maybe need to listen a little bit more to what younger voters are saying in some of the groups that represent younger voters. And younger voters are, really demographically different than older Democratic voters. And that also is part of why I think they react differently to the current crisis than maybe you would have seen in past elections.
And of course, we've been talking about Israel and Palestine for a while now, but then we also have this new layer to add to foreign policy, which is Israel and Iran.
Right. I mean, it's a major foreign policy crisis for the United States. The Biden administration, the last thing it wants is to get drawn into a wider Middle East war. The last thing it wants is American planes over Iran or near Iran engaging with Iranian forces. That can really spin out of control and become something, you can't plan for that. Once you're at war, you can't plan for everything that might happen. And so that's a difficult situation. Joe Biden, in the Biden administration, they're trying to tamp down escalation. Their foreign policy efforts right now are oriented around keeping American allies on board, keeping Israel from reacting really strongly to the Iranian missile attack, things like that kind of handle the international situation. I don't think most voters are paying close attention to that right now, but they absolutely would be paying close attention if American aircraft carriers are launching strikes on Iran, right? Everybody's going to know about that. And it's difficult to predict what effect that has on the election. I mean, it could go both ways. A wider war in the Middle East could be something where people rally around the president, rally around the flag, and that might improve Joe Biden's favorability ratings. Or it could be something where if the public is really opposed to that conflict, it could be damaging to him. I wouldn't be able to say right now. We'd have to see what happened. But certainly in the past, those kinds of effects do occur.
So for the time being, heading into November in a few months, you don't really see any big changes happening in this space.
No, but external events really will have a big effect. It's a long time between now and November. This conflict has been going on now since last October. And then there's also Ukraine. There are other foreign policy issues. Immigration is in some ways a foreign policy issue, along with a domestic politics issue. So it's not, people who are trying to evaluate foreign policy are not going to be looking at this just through the lens of a single conflict. They may be looking at a whole number of things. But again, most voters foreign policy isn't at the top of their list. They're probably more concerned about the economy, about immigration, about social issues like abortion, which is going to be huge in this election.
With those issues being the top of the list, what are going to be the challenges that each candidate is really going to face and have to really address on the campaign trail in these months to come?
Well, I think that, say, starting with abortion, you see Republicans right now really scrambling to try to change their position on abortion. You can't change your fundamental position on something you've been campaigning against for 40 years. Voters see through that. But you're definitely seeing that. But at the same time, Biden has to keep it at the forefront. He has to keep people talking about it. He's getting kind of an assist from the Alabama Supreme Court, the Arizona Supreme Court, but he needs to hit that as an issue and make sure voters are thinking about it and thinking about the contrast between him and Donald Trump on that issue. If you look at immigration, that's probably an issue where Trump feels like he has an advantage. He takes a really hard line on immigration. He's promising to deport millions of undocumented immigrants and things like that. There's not much Biden's going to do to swing anti-immigration voters over to his side. And the risk that he runs is if he tries to be tough on immigration to kind of moderate on that issue, he may alienate important groups in the Democratic coalition. So he's got to look at both kind of his opponents, but also his own party on that. Trump has to do that on abortion. If Trump comes out in favor of, more liberalized abortion regulation regime, he risks alienating Christian conservatives who are his base, who are the key to his election. They're probably not going to be satisfied with something like 15-week bans or let every state do what it wants. That's not what they've been fighting for 4 decades. They want more than that. So each of them has the kind of the twin challenge of differentiating themselves from their opponent, but also maintaining and consolidating support from their base, the people who they need to turn out and vote for them.
There are centrist voters on both sides of the aisle, but this election, I feel like the candidates are so vastly different from each other. So it seems as if there really aren't any centrist voters that they're targeting.
Well, I think that the parties are really sorted now. And, the Republican Party is the conservative party. The Democratic Party is the liberal party. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, that wasn't true. There were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats back then. We don't have that now. The most conservative Democrat is still more liberal than the most liberal Republican. The number of centrist voters or true independents, people who are actually up for grabs, is tiny. And they, for the most part, are people who don't pay very much attention to politics. So it's pretty difficult to reach that group. What campaigns really focus on now is looking at the people who are inclined to support you, but maybe don't always turn out to vote. And get them out to vote. We call them in political science low propensity voters, but the people who need a little bit of urging. And so you'll see a campaign focusing on things, get out the vote drives, voter registration drives, canvassing, right? Reminding voters when election day is, reminding them to register to vote, reminding them to get state issued ID in Ohio. That's going to be an important thing. People aren't going to necessarily realize that the voter ID law has changed and they can't walk in with a utility bill and vote this time like they could the last presidential election. So campaigns will really focus on things like that. Probably more than they're going to be trying to reach the person who's Joe Biden, Donald Trump, I can't decide. They're going to try to find the people who've already decided, but just need a little kick in the pants to get out of bed on election day.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch the campaigns do it, because I think people, if they're really paying close attention, they'll notice within the different speeches that there are certain audiences for certain messages. And so it's going to be a long road to November, but I look forward to seeing it happen. And I thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And that's this week's Community Focus. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and have a great week.